All right, thank you everyone that called in, and thank you Candace for the introduction and the council for having us. As Candace mentioned, I'm the project manager for SOKIN, and Janet is on our science working group. So she's really active in that group, and I thought she'd be a great person to kind of share some of the science that's going on, not only for acidification broadly, but also focusing in kind of on case studies in the Southeast. So we're really excited to I've been invited to this particularly because we've been doing a lot of work on framing acidification as a water quality issue. And I'll talk about more kind of why that is, but it's been kind of an advantageous route when we're talking about the Southeast. What you see here, by the way, is a story map. This is the first time we're presenting in this kind of format. So if there's any glitches, just bear with me. All right, so here's our contact info, and I'll show you that again at the end. All right, so just like any acidification webinar, we just kind of wanted to get started with the global problem, give a little bit of context. Most of you are familiar, of course, with the global problem of ocean acidification. The oceans absorb about 1/3 of the carbon dioxide we emit into the atmosphere. That carbon dioxide reacts with seawater to briefly form carbonic acid, which then dissociates into bicarbonate ions and free hydrogens that is kind of the cause in that reduction in pH. So it also will shift that equilibrium towards bicarbonate as opposed to carbonate, which is the structure that forms many of the bivalves and corals. And so that's why it often presents a problem as we shift that equilibrium away from the carbonate ion and decrease the saturation state of carbonate in the water. So kind of at the global scale, we're seeing ocean acidification being monitored through the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network. Unfortunately, this image is just an image. It doesn't actually link into the portal. But GOON is a great platform for seeing all of the ongoing monitoring that we're doing for acidification at the global scale. We'll share the story afterwards too, so you can click on all of these links and it'll actually take you directly to the different resources that we're talking about. But for example, here's GOON. Once we kind of zoom in on one of those monitoring efforts, and you can see that these buoys can be used to directly inform hatchery operations, for example, on the West Coast. So this is real-time data that's kind of spinning out all of those carbonate chemistry parameters in places where we're seeing conditions for which hatcheries actually have to adapt and mitigate to those changes. But the problem is, if we kind of zoom into the GOON portal and look at the Southeast, we can see that there's not a ton of information about what's going on in our coastal regions. So it's really limiting, and our ability to understand kind of the drivers of coastal acidification are really limited based on limited monitoring at this point, and we'll talk more about that. So what is coastal acidification? Coastal acidification is kind of an entirely different problem that results in the same things in a way, in that we're still talking about different mechanisms that increase carbon dioxide and decrease the pH, though again through totally different ways than our atmospheric absorption mechanism. So for example, eutrophication is a major link between acidification often, and Janet will talk you through some of those mechanisms and how we're seeing those mechanisms changing coastal water quality, particularly in the Southeast. So just kind of a brief introduction to coastal acidification, but we'll talk about the chemistry a little bit more later. So my role as the project manager, I just wanted to kind of introduce you to this idea of the coastal acidification networks. The coastal acidification networks are formed through a partnership with NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program, regional IOOS associations, and in that case for SOKIN, it's SOKORA, or the Southeast Regional Ocean Observing a regional association, so SOKORA, who hosts SOKIN, and often other entities often support these different networks as well. So we have 6 regional CANs throughout the country. And a lot of these were kind of formed based on where the problem was seen first. So, for example, the California Acidification Network has been up and running for a long time, where GCAN in the Gulf and SOKIN and MACAN are relatively new to the CAN networks. Our goal for these CANs is to kind of separate the global problem of acidification to all of the different coastal issues that we're seeing. So the CANs strive to kind of synthesize regional science, make it applicable to the stakeholders and the resources in those regions, and communicate with stakeholders in a way that we might not be able to do at a global and kind of national level. So specific to SOKAN, we've been working on those kind of linkages with water quality, working on publications to get that information out there, working on communication products like the story map and web material. We have a new data portal that will be coming soon, so I'll actually update the story map when we have that portal out in the next month or so, that synthesizes all the monitoring efforts and cruises specific to the Southeast. And lastly, we're working on stakeholder workshops as well. And so if anyone's interested, our next workshop, we do one in each state. We've done North Carolina. We're actually going to combine South Carolina and Georgia, and that'll be in Charleston in late July. So please reach out if you have any interest in joining that. And then particularly relevant to this group, I just wanted to introduce our SOKAN monitoring workshop that we did February of last year. We looked at kind of 40 different gradients across the Southeast, from chemical to biological to even social parameters, and try to prioritize monitoring locations so that when those funding opportunities come out, we could really start running with those different ideas that we had. So we looked at things like population change. We know that the Southeast has some of the most significant population change in all the United States, so we want to understand how that population change influences development and things like impervious surfaces that Janet will talk about more later. And we've also incorporated things like temperature and the location of the Gulf Stream. So for example, we proposed a Gulf Stream buoy that would help us indicate where the Gulf Stream is and how that might influence inshore chemistry. So again, you'll be able to kind of access each of these locations, click on the map, and see why we chose each one of these as a priority monitoring location. All right, so moving into the kind of coastal acidification problem, I just wanted to put this quote here because, we had our first North Carolina stakeholder workshop a couple months ago, and just like this webinar, we often stick, or at least start talking about acidification as a global issue. And it was kind of a big moment when, listening to all these stakeholders, and maybe that's something that's particular to the Southeast, I'm not sure, but they were just like, we don't really want to hear it. We want to hear about acidification as a coastal water quality issue and how it's affecting maybe their operations much closer to home. And so that's really started to drive kind of the direction that we want to go in SOKAN, and making those, it kind of offers an opportunity for state level and local level mitigation and adaptation efforts that we might not be able to see at federal or global level. So we're going to kind of take the rest of the time to talk more about the coastal acidification chemistry and the story behind it. So we'll switch over to Janet's screen.
So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the coastal drivers and how coastal and ocean acidification has now been kind of segregated into two separate problems. As Leslie briefly touched on, stakeholders are very interested in what's going on in the coastal zone because that's where we have aquaculture, and of course our socioeconomic impacts are much more profound where there are more coastal populations. Of course, we can't ignore the open ocean, and we certainly don't, but as far as the CANs are concerned, as long as we stick to the coastal environment, we seem to be making everyone happy with the direction of research. So as Leslie discussed a little bit earlier, this acidification problem is driven by excess inorganic carbon species that interact with the hydrogen ions in water. So obviously we're not going to be able to reduce hydrogen ions, but we certainly can, as a global community, work to mitigate the inputs of the different inorganic carbon species that go into our coastal ocean. But before we do that, we have to figure out the mechanistic drivers, or the mechanisms that drive acidification, so that we can target remediation or mitigation as kind of on a state and local level. So when we talk about the dissolved inorganic carbon that's going into the coastal region, we're basically talking about the sum of carbon dioxide, carbonic acid, bicarbonate ion, and carbonate. But another very important component here is the alkalinity. The alkalinity is the buffer, and it's composed of all of these other ions. I'm not going to name them all right now, but some of the very important ones that we focus on are phosphate and ammonium, because those are the ones that typically come from terrestrial inputs, or in this case, eutrophication. So when these excess amounts of different components of alkalinity and dissolved inorganic carbon enter the coastal zone is when we have excessive problems or the lack of buffering. So in this case, what I really want to focus on here is the carbonate alkalinity and what we're also calling the organic acids, because these are coming from land, and that's when it becomes a water quality issue rather than an oceanic issue. So typically speaking, main sources of DIC in the ocean and alkalinity are pretty fixed, but when we talk about introducing the coastal component, all of the anthropogenic inputs are what kind of cause this acidification or eutrophication, which would be in excess of either one of natural processes. So when we talk about the mechanistic drivers, what we're talking about is for alkalinity and DIC, and we're talking about transported DIC, so coming from the land or coming from any distal source. We're also thinking about biological organic matter degradation or respiration, which can be a source and it's an input of DIC into the coastal zone, or it could be that DIC can be consumed by photosynthesis, which then creates another issue, because when you have excessive primary production, you have excessive organic matter, and then as that organic matter is decomposed, you have even more DIC. So it's kind of a positive feedback where the more nutrients you have, the more inorganic nutrient sources you have for primary production, then the more organic matter. So it just keeps feeding back on itself. Another mechanistic driver of increased inorganic carbon in the coastal zone is absorption from the atmosphere, and then changes due to thermal variation. So in the spring and the summer, when water temperatures warm, it actually increases the partial pressure in the water, and that's a thermodynamic relationship between temperature and inorganic carbon. And I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of thermodynamics and carbonate chemistry, but those are changes that are also enhanced by global warming. So you're always going to have a seasonal cycle and a long-term cycle. And so as we synthesize data in the coastal zone, those are two things that we have to always be concerned about, is what's the seasonal and what's the long-term change, and what can, how do those drivers actually interact with each other. So we've given a graphic here that outlines some of these processes, but I just want to point out that this is for the West Coast, and as Leslie and I were preparing this presentation, we actually realized that there isn't a good synthesis of processes for the East Coast, so that may be something that we want to work on in not too distant future. But one main difference between the West Coast and the East Coast is the upwelling and also the river inputs. Now, because Leslie and I are both work in the Southeast, we are much more familiar with southeast processes and a little bit of the northeast processes. But we don't have the same kind of upwelling. It's not as strong, but the Gulf Stream does cause some upwelling onto the continental shelf in the southeast. And rivers are clearly much more important on the southeast than in the southwest because there just are more. It's not an arid climate. And so the climate drivers are also things that we have to consider, especially when we're talking about precipitation and river stream flow. So river stream flow is very important because rivers have lower alkalinity and lower buffering capacity than the ocean. So additionally, we have to think about what's going on in rivers, not just estuaries and oceans. So another important thing is the carbonate alkalinity is altered by mineral formation and dissolution. So that's a process that is typically considered a biological driver, but will not necessarily affect both alkalinity and DIC. So if alkalinity is drawn down by the formation of mineral aragonite minerals, then it's going to kind of it makes it harder for pH to be balanced. So that's when DIC is in excess of alkalinity, and if alkalinity is being drawn down by mineral formation, then we could potentially see some acidic conditions. But for each region, the chemistry changes slightly. But just to kind of highlight a little bit again, the difference between open ocean carbonate chemistry and coastal carbonate chemistry is that the two main sources of inorganic carbon to the ocean through the dissolution from the atmosphere. So you have CO2 gas exchange, or you have CO2 uptake or respiration via photosynthesis. However, in the coastal zone, we end up with other mechanistic drivers that deliver, again, excess nutrients that could cause eutrophication and then excessive primary production. But then the freshwater entering the coastal zone is also lower in alkalinity. So the balance between the carbonate system in the open ocean and the coastal ocean is vastly different. And the farther out to sea, obviously, the less influence you have from land. So again, that's kind of why we try to distinguish between coastal and ocean, is because the mechanistic drivers seem to have different proportion of influence over the overall chemistry. So as I mentioned, rivers are more important on the East Coast, and you can clearly see why. So this graphic gives a general idea of the river contributions to coastal acidification. So the redder the river here, the lower the pH. So that could potentially mean the higher the dissolved inorganic carbon is that's entering into the coastal ocean. And as Leslie mentioned before, we have a lot of links up here, so please feel free to take the time and go check out this website, the National Research Defense Council website on ocean acidification. That's where this graphic is from. So each river has different carbonate chemistry, and that's going to depend on the type of watershed that the river runs through. So if the watershed has high dissolved inorganic carbon going into the river, then more dissolved inorganic carbon is going to be delivered to the coastal zone. But if that river also runs through a region where there's a lot of carbonate minerals, then the hydrology is going to also affect the amount of DIC and alkalinity that is delivered to the coastal zone. Another big contributor, especially in wet regions, is acid rain. And so acid rain can have an effect on the differential mineral dissolution on land. And then again, since all of the tributaries and rivers run into the sea, everything that happens on land somehow ends up in our coastal ocean. Just it's a matter of time. Another mechanistic driver of coastal acidification that is directly influenced by land use or anthropogenic contributions is this idea of the impervious surfaces. So impervious surfaces not only disrupt natural water flow, but they also disrupt natural biological production, sinks for carbon and alkalinity. And so if you have all these organic acids that are in the soil, and the organic acids are going to contribute to alkalinity, if the flow of water is disrupted by pavement, then you're also going to lose that alkalinity that runs into the river, and then the river is going to be thrown off balance between the DIC and the alkalinity, and you're going to end up with lower pH, which is greater acidity, in the fresh water that's running into the coastal region. So this is an example of Charleston in 2001. The red surfaces are the impervious surfaces. And then if you look at it in 2011, 10 years later, we can see that there is an increase in impervious surfaces. And of course, this isn't just a problem, or this isn't just something that occurs in Charleston, but it occurs all over the United States. Very recently, the floods in Houston this past year were unprecedented, and one of the reasons that water builds up is that it has nowhere to go. So we have covered the ground, the natural sediments, with pavement, and so again, we do not allow the water to travel in its normal path, and so, or go to its normal watershed. And so when water flows to the sea, it's no longer flowing through natural surfaces, and so these natural processes of bacterial remineralization of organic matter that produce the alkalinity, or the organic acids for alkalinity, it just doesn't occur. So rivers, or most rivers in the United States, are tending to be more acidic these days, and when that water enters the coastal zone, we're already entering the coastal zone with low pH water. So one of the main focuses of research in the United States has recently been watershed, land use, and fertilizers going into our coastal zone. And that's something that we've been studying now for over 2 decades. I mean, I remember when I was an undergrad, my first research project was eutrophication in the Great South Bay off of Long Island. And we talked mostly about fertilizers from farmland, from golf courses, and from homes. And these contaminants leach through the soil and the watershed into the tributaries and rivers and to the coastal zone, and can contribute to increased enhanced primary production. And then this background here is an example of a phytoplankton bloom. So where does all of this phytoplankton organic matter go when it dies? Well, it sinks, it's bacterially remineralized, and it draws down the oxygen concentration, but it also adds CO2 to the bottom waters. And one of the things that we've studied very extensively in Chesapeake Bay and Narragansett Bay, as well as the Gulf of Mexico, are these dead zones where the oxygen is depleted and the CO2 is very high. So it ends up with these low oxygen, high CO2 regions that are acidic, and usually happen these days on pretty frequent basis on seasonal scales. So this is what I just said, that the excess primary production can dramatically change water chemistry. And I think, yes, next slide. So we've included a couple of examples, and this map needs to grow. I mean, this is, as Leslie stated, the first time that we've used this medium for any presentation, and it's very exciting because we can add these dots in. You can click on them, and we've linked here to several research studies. As I said, this map will definitely grow, because as research increases and problems are enhanced in the coastal zone, then we continually add research projects. So I just wanted to point out that right now we don't have a dot here for the central region of the South Atlantic Bight, because we are still working on it, and I have actually just started working on it, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So another main issue when we talk about acidification is the tidal influence, and tides influence the DIC and the alkalinity content of the water from two ends. You have the ocean end member and you have the freshwater end member, but within the estuaries, the cycling of organic matter is continuous, and depending on the season can exceed even the oceanic end member, because the oceanic end member is typically higher than the freshwater end member. This slide, I'm going to start over here on this side with just a quick overview of tidal frequency and changes in DIC and TA and pH, and then I'm going to tell you, link it to sea level rise, which is this part of the graphic over here. So water masses with different acidities are going to mix in the estuary, and that can create buffering minimum and maximum zones that can change on the tide. It also depends on the tidal height. Some regions don't have a very low tide, tidal difference between low tide and high tide, and so if the freshwater volume entering the estuary is high enough, the tide may have very little impact. However, little impact on the location of where the buffering minimum and maximum zones are. This is particularly an example from Georgia salt marshes. So just from a seasonal perspective, the red and orange lines are the DIC and the alkalinity, and the blue line is the pH. So when the tide is low, you can see that pH is actually decreased with respect to when it's high, and that's because we have lower pH waters entering in from the freshwater portion, and the tide comes in and it increases the pH because ocean pH is higher than freshwater pH. And this particular study was carried out over the spring and summer of 2012 and 13, and the summer and winter is going to be different in Georgia salt marshes just because of the freshwater flow from the rivers. I think this is link. Oh, we didn't get the link in here, but if you need references, please feel free to email me. I'm very happy to provide those. Oh, I'm sorry, and I said I was going to link it to sea level rise. So this graphic represents what the coastline of the southeast United States would look like, and actually the graphic can extend out to the entire United States if sea level were to rise 1 foot. So in the Georgia salt marshes, what we're mostly concerned with is that salt marshes, the sediments in salt marshes are large sinks for dissolved inorganic carbon and carbonate alkalinity, as well as organic alkalinity. So if sea level rises and we disrupt the natural tidal channels and water rises over the salt marsh banks, then we're going to have a large pulse of high DIC, but also high alkalinity. And if freshwater stays the same, we would probably expect pH to remain just about the same, but it depends on what the DIC to alkalinity ratio would be. If the organic alkalinity from all of the organic and humic substances within the salt marshes is high enough, then the increase in the DIC may not affect the pH. But if the DIC exceeds the alkalinity to a point much greater than a ratio of 1 to 1, then we would in fact expect the pH to decrease and the coastal zone to become even more acidified. Now, I will point out that in the Georgia marshes, we can't really say yet where that trend is going, because we haven't been able to analyze long-term data to look at changes, interannual changes in pH. We are still on the tidal and seasonal level. So that is going to bring me into what we're calling a case study here, kind of an example using the South Atlantic Bight and Georgia marshes. And so I just want to quickly zoom in over here and say that we have started a synthesis based using data from the Grays Reef CO2 mooring. You can click on this later and it'll take you directly to the website where you can preview real-time data. And then over here, we've outlined the study region for the Georgia Coastal Ecosystems Long-Term Ecological Research Study, which is an NSF-funded LTER site. So just a quick overview. Out at the Grays Reef mooring, we've had a time series running since 2006. This graphic and the link down here to the paper is from the mooring, the first 18 months of the mooring. And I just want to point out that down here on the bottom, we're going to look at the orange and the black lines. This is river stream flow. So this is water volume measured at Doctortown, Georgia, which is above the head of the tide in the Altamaha River, which is the largest tributary to the South Atlantic Bight. After we found that shortly after increases in river discharge, we would find decreases in pH. And that's to be expected, knowing that river water is lower in pH than estuarine water. But what's most remarkable is that the Grays Reef mooring is offshore. It's approximately 64 kilometers southeast of Savannah, so out here. And then this is the Doctortown site is it's about up in this region. Actually, maybe even a little farther up. I can't see well on this map. But it takes approximately 42 to 60 days for water during typical flow period from Doctortown out to the Grays Reef mooring. And so with this large pulse of river water, and even not particularly large ones, you can see that that pH does decrease. I believe this decrease right here that is concurrent with this river peak is coming from somewhere else. This is because it wouldn't show up the same day at the mooring. So within that 40 some odd day period, this peak down here is the one that we would correlate to, or I'm sorry, this trough in pH is something that we would correlate to this peak in river stream flow. And then another thing that we've done out at the Grays Reef mooring is that we're measuring, it constantly measures PCO2, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the surface. And we've been measuring that again since 2006. I did a time series analysis, and I just want to draw your attention to the black line, which is the CO2 from 2006 through the middle of 2014, and the red line, which is the linear increase, and this is after a method of deseasonalization, and then the purple line, which is PCO2 adjusted to show only non-thermal or kind of free from temperature influence. So, and this blue line, which is that linear increase. And so we know in the South Atlantic Bight at the Grays Reef mooring that there is a linear increase over this period of time from 4 to 6 atmospheres per year. Now, just to put that in perspective, the global atmospheric CO2 increase is just under 2 microatmospheres per year. Then taking that a step farther, we did a synthesis of over 50 cruises in the South Atlantic Bight, and we divided the system up into a coastal, inner shelf, middle shelf, and oceanic shelf, and also found that CO2 is increasing across the entire South Atlantic Bight region between 3 and 4.5 microatmospheres per year, which is a corresponding decrease in pH or increase in acidity of 0.003 to 0.004 pH units per year. So that's fairly significant because if you remember, pH is measured on a log scale. So with that in mind, we need to really have a better understanding of what the direct impact is from the coastal zone, because if this were just an ocean acidification issue, we would expect the increase in CO2 in the surface across the board to roughly equal the increase in the atmosphere. However, the increases in PCO2 in the surface ocean in the South Atlantic Bight are above what the atmospheric increase is. So we know that there's some other component. And in this particular study, which is linked here, we eliminated temperature as a potential cause for the increase above what the atmospheric increase would be. So that leaves terrestrial influence, and we really need to get more into the understanding of what's going on in coastal marshes. So that's where the Georgia Coastal Ecosystems long-term ecological research comes into play. These colored polygons here are the different study sites where we've been sampling for all sorts of components. We're talking DIC, alkalinity, phosphate, nitrate, ammonia, silicate, salinity, temperature, sea level, pH, those are the ones, chlorophyll, those are the ones that come to my head right now. And so right now we're working on synthesizing all of that data to really start looking at the linkage between eutrophication and acidification in Georgia coastal estuaries. So again, as I mentioned, we know that pH is lower in freshwater. So here we have salinity versus pH on the y-axis in 4 different rivers in the South Atlantic Bight. So there's no doubt here that pH is certainly lower, but what's going on in the estuary, that's where we have a large question mark at the moment. We can, from conservative mixing, so if you take the ocean end member and you theoretically draw a linear relationship to the ocean end member, we can predict what the DIC and the alkalinity should be, but there's so many processes going on in the estuaries that at this time we're unable to tease out the individual how the individual mechanistic processes actually affect the overall total going across the estuary. So again, this is going back to some of the research that's being conducted in the Georgia coastal estuaries right now. We're looking at dissolved inorganic carbon versus the water level. And so again, going back to what could potentially happen with mean sea level is if sea level increases, we actually expect to see a decrease, but that's most likely because of concentration in the water column. So when you have low tide and you have these very high concentrations, we expect that that's because it's, concentration of an element is dependent on how much water is also there. Or the other thing that we attribute this to is turbulent mixing from the tidal currents. So it's going to depend on the depth of the tidal channel as well. And then this is actually unpublished data at the moment. We're looking at dissolved inorganic carbon and alkalinity in the Altamaha River. And surprisingly, over the last 3 years, it's dissolved inorganic carbon has been decreasing, but a longer-term rate going back to the end of 2002 does have DIC increasing. And so over time, there are going to be variable rates of change as well. And so it's really important to have these long-term time series because we can compare these concentrations of DIC and alkalinity to river stream flow. So there's definitely a direct effect when you have like a river stream flow increase. The concentration of DIC and alkalinity actually decreases, and again, that's because it's an effect of just the dilution properties. But when you look at the flux to the coastal zone, the flux actually increases with increased river stream flow. So even if you have a low concentration of DIC and TA, because you have a very high river stream flow, there's going to be a large amount of DIC and TA that actually is delivered to the coastal zone. So I'm going to hand this back over to Leslie and hope that I actually made you think about some things, and there will be questions, which I'm very much looking forward to.
All right. So just to kind of, oh, sorry, I didn't think about how this, just to kind of bring our head back around to highlight why it's so important to monitor in the coastal zone. Just taking a look at this map on the left here. So, and I guess, you know, the why monitoring question, obviously I'm preaching to the choir with this crowd. But I wanted to highlight kind of this idea of these global ocean models. So what this red color is showing, with deeper reds being a sooner time to low aragonite saturation state. So the darker it is, the closer the time scale to reaching about 1.5, which is when they see kind of decreases in kind of hatchery outputs and effects to some shellfish. So if you look at that global model, basically we're kind of look like we're in the clear here in that gray zone. But if you look at the colors that are actually on these states, these colors indicate kind of total vulnerability that incorporates economic sensitivity based on kind of shellfish harvests and permits and things like that. Also, how well these areas can adapt. And you know, most importantly, it highlights the coastal acidification portion of the equation. And so you can see there's kind of a really big, clear mismatch between what we're seeing in these global ocean models for acidification and what we know about what's happening at the coast for coastal acidification. So, for example, North Carolina is one of the most vulnerable states in the country to coastal acidification because of their low ability to adapt, their high economic sensitivity, and because of those eutrophic rivers, particularly in the Pamlico. So that kind of highlights why we need this coastal monitoring. And then, you know, on our map, this was also on the, when we talked about the monitoring workshop, but this is our existing monitoring that we have in the Southeast. So these ones in yellow are the continuous monitoring sites, and then this is one that's kind of taken at different temporal for discrete sampling. Just to note too, we have a new Tampa Bay mooring that just went in last December, so you can access that real-time data here. But obviously just having these particular locations, some of them relatively well offshore, make it very difficult to discern all of those mechanisms for coastal acidification. The challenge is, though, that we, you know, as much as we want to continue efforts to maybe incorporate things like citizen science, is that measuring carbonate chemistry is really difficult. I just wanted to plug the new Ocean Acidification Information Exchange that'll be linked here. This is a new platform for kind of collaboration and communication about acidification. And about 2 weeks ago, this question came up about alternatives for mercuric chloride. So mercuric chloride is something that we need when we poison samples for DIC and TA, just to kill off any microorganisms that might be respiring CO2 in the samples. And, you know, that little thing kind of really limits sometimes our expansion into things like citizen science, because we haven't found a good way. Although I did want to point out there was very fruitful discussion in this link about that, although at the end, a lot of ideas, but we're still not there yet. But particularly with this crowd, I wanted to talk about opportunities. This is a main reason that we wanted to present, is that we're all often in a position where we need to leverage different opportunities for monitoring. And of course, there's no better crowd than to know all of those kind of existing efforts. I'm not sure why it's not showing up, but this was supposed to highlight the upcoming East Coast ocean acidification cruise. So every couple years, the OAP funds different cruises that take place along the West Coast or Gulf of Mexico and East Coast. And it's the East Coast turn this summer. So there'll be transects that used to be on this map that run in and off the coast into each of those states. And the boat can't go into super shallow waters, particularly in the southeast with our long slope and shelf. So we're looking at different opportunities to maybe correspond those transects with inshore sampling, so that when the ship comes in, we're also taking samples close to land that can really highlight some of the coastal drivers that we're seeing for the samples that they're taking offshore. So I'll get those fixed, and I would love to talk to people more about different opportunities over the summer to potentially capture those samples. So that's it. Here's some things you can do. Sign up for our monthly newsletter if you're interested, our website. Please feel free to contact us with our emails for any questions, and hopefully we can kind of spearhead maybe some opportunities and resources to get joint monitoring efforts off the ground. And that's it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you, Janet. Just as a reminder to everybody, we are taking Q&A at this time, so feel free to enter your questions on the chat feature. Make sure that you send those to both the host and the panelists so that we can all see them. So I'll go ahead and start asking some of the questions that I've seen coming in. One of them is...
Sorry, Janet. Could you do me a favor? If you just allow me to share my screen for a second, I just pulled up the East Coast Ocean Acidification cruise map.
Yeah,
and,
thank you. Handing it over to you right now.
There we go. So this is generally going to be our cruise map. There might be, well, we have to transverse down to Miami from this last transect. And there may be a transect across the Bahama Channel right here. But this is essentially where we're going to be. We have a relatively good idea of where and when at this point. So if anybody sees any opportunity along here, they can email Leslie or myself or both of us. I do have a cruise schedule that should work out to at least get within one day of where we'll be when we'll be there. So it'll be it's during July. This cruise is during July.
Great.